Hello, everyone, and welcome to part three of our U.S. Summer Learning Series, Shaping Better Futures, Bringing the Value of Cultural Context to Insights. Before we get started with our session and introduce our speaker, I'm just going to go through a few housekeeping items. During the session, please add your question into the Q&A box. We'll have time at the end to answer some questions, and if we don't get to your question, we'll definitely follow up with you afterwards. Immediately following the session, we will be sharing the full session recording for you to watch on demand or also to share back with your teams and your organization. And without further ado, let's welcome our speaker for today's session, Michael Thomas, who joins us from Space Doctors, the culture and creative sister agency of Humanate. And as brand transformation lead, Michael is building teams to help inform business and design direction for brand, positioning, strategy, and portfolio through integrating social science and semiotic research perspectives and approaches. So with that, Michael, take it away, and I'll pass the mic over to you.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Greg. Thank you. Now let's just jump right in. So Peter Drucker once said that the best way to predict the future is to create it. And I think we can underestimate how much more this is than just a clever aphorism. So I'd love to tease this out a little bit today in the context of applying an understanding of culture to insights, creative, and strategy. So first, let's take a moment to look at why understanding culture isn't reducible to just aggregating an understanding of individual people. To use a metaphor of ocean life, if you were to tell me that you understood fish, but you never discussed, referenced, or even considered water, I might tell you that you might not know that much about fish. If people are who we study, their culture is as significant to them as water is to fish. It informs the very composition of their behavior, and nothing much makes sense without it. So for this reason, a cultural understanding is a powerful complement to more traditional consumer research, and I'll hopefully explain why. So consumer research can reveal existing ideas, beliefs, values, desires, and pain points. However, the examination of culture reveals what will shape those ideas, what will shape those beliefs, the values, and those desires of tomorrow. And as a social species, culture is basically our operating system. You can't successfully build a brand, a product, a service without acknowledging the cultural context within which it exists. And those who lead culturally tend to be more successful than those who follow behind it. So for the next 20 minutes or so, you'll hear me harp on and on about culture. I'm an anthropologist. That's a bit of what we do, but there's a reason, and I hope to offer some insight into that and to help see how we can put a cultural understanding to work. So a cultural approach, it's not a replacement, but as we saw with fish and water, it's a necessity. So it's a complement to traditional research methods that are more consumer-based. And the cultural approach has some distinctive advantages to those complementary approaches that we may be already familiar with, such as consumer research, human-centered design, design thinking, market research, etc. And one advantage is that it represents how, where, and with what people make sense of the world. And since the world is changing, culture is one of the most powerful indicators of what matters. So first off, when would you take a cultural approach? So the questions that it best answers, ones like that we get a lot, tend to look a lot like this here. They indicate a sense that the world is indeed changing, that some sense making is in order, and that there's a felt need for some guidance or an anchor to rethink categories, to rethink how we understand who our customers are, or to rethink our own position. So let's unpack why culture is important, especially in conditions where the world is changing pretty radically. So if you can forgive the extended maritime metaphors for just a moment, there's a number of ways for companies to anchor their understanding of the world. It could be in your own capabilities, in your understanding of a problem to be solved, in your brand, or in the customers and users themselves. But we're currently facing wide-scale disruption impacting every one of these topics. So much so that there isn't any one aspect of the world that isn't entirely dependent on another, and each are changing. So let me give you an example. Prior to joining Space Doctors, part of Humanate, I came from the automotive industry where I spent upwards of 20 years. And if you know the automotive industry, you know that it's undergoing tremendous shifts that begin to all be colliding kind of all at once. So where once the vision of highly automated and connected dense urban centers kind of captured the imagination of new mobility, ushering moments of investment in autonomous vehicles and V2X technology and experiments and handoff and takeover interactions, for example. Now, social shifts, economic pressures, policy incentives, and technological complexity have really shifted our intention. So that cybernetic urban future of Blade Runner may look something more like an optimized distributed network of future cloud services and energy and logistics. So with advances in electrification, for example, the potential for distributed energy networks and new business models places the onus back on the automotive company to reassess what capabilities are most important to develop. So in this case, it's going to be less about longitudinal and lateral control of a vehicle or handing off control, and it's going to be a lot more about energy management and partnerships, for example. So in short, doubling down on your core capabilities isn't really much of an anchor when the context changes so radically that whole new capabilities must be developed. And that invites new challenges for what the problem space of mobility even is. The problem to solve is less about merely moving people from one space to another. These shifts and advancements in remote working combined with economic pressures related to affordability and infrastructure make our problem less about traditional mobility than about maybe stationary experiences or energy business modeling or grid management, affordability and resale models, quality and behavior change. So anchoring on core capabilities like vehicular control, for example, might not necessarily be the path to anticipate problems of tomorrow. So if you're not able to look through the lens of your current capabilities, your current products and your current services, or through your years of experience understanding the nuances of the problem to be solved, which may no longer be the problem to solve, perhaps you anchor your new perspective in your customers, your users, and with people. After all, that's what being human-centered is all about, of course. But the challenge there is no less complex. Starting with customers won't help you if you don't know who your customers are in this rapidly changing world. Maybe it's not someone who buys your current product or service at all currently. Maybe they're not a user of a product. Maybe they're a subscriber of a service. Maybe they're not who you've segmented and understood relative to your older development model. And if it's the user you're going to start with, then we have to ask ourselves, a user of what? If we're talking about reinventing our business, our product or services and what we offer, if we're not yet sure what solutions we need capability in, then we can't be sure how to define a user. And so if we expand our purview to people more broadly, then where do we even start? If we start with all of the people, it's a lot of people to understand and to represent. And in that broadest possible context, how is who you select ensuring that your work is both inclusive and representative? If you're looking at serving people more broadly, how are you going to assure for that? And to be clear, this situation of this 360-degree disruption is not limited to automotive. So ecological and social concerns about microplastics, for example, along with trends in fashion, are upsetting the business of contact lenses. Fluid and emerging identities, notions of privacy and representation are starting to problematize the development of AI tools and facial recognition and recommender programs. And commercial real estate is still coming to grips with technological and social shifts around workplaces. And so the world is always shifting. And typically we can look at trends, weak signals, and strong trajectories. But the challenge still remains regarding what to do with this information and how to put it to work. So trends and signals alone offer no guidance without some context, without a way to interpret them. So where do we start when we need to rethink our business we're in, what capabilities we do, what we need, and who our customers are? So we need to really look at something else. We need a new anchor. And of course, I did warn you, I'm talking about culture. And what is more human than culture? Not sure. So that's what this new anchor is all about. So what is good about a cultural approach, and what does a cultural approach do? Well, it can tell you what's important to whom, how to group and separate and compare your audience based on patterns of real behavior. Now, culture itself, of course, is always changing. And here's just a really accessible example of the ways in which fitness has been interpreted culturally through time. It's definitely changed over the years. But what is constant about culture is that it's observable. Culture is an empirical phenomenon that we can see, touch, hear, smell, and taste. It can be tracked, compared, interpreted, and created. And this last point is something I think is most important and we'll return to in a moment. But for now, let's talk about a new ability to observe with detail at scale and with assistance of artificial intelligence and large data sets, made powerful when put into context of our qualitative understanding. So qualitative work is crucial for understanding context, nuance, and the unsaid, but it's always been a challenge to scale it and to examine culture with a high degree of detail with any spontaneity. So some new AI tools in conjunction with qualitative work can really help fill those gaps. Through an analysis of online discourse, imagery, and user-generated content, and even official sources, you can identify the conversations, behaviors, motivations, triggers, beliefs, and values. And you can triangulate quantitative analytics with qualitative cultural work, for example, semiotics and ethnography, in order to really contextualize what you learn at scale with what you can learn in much richer detail. And with these methods, you can examine culture, specifically what anthropologists call a cultural model, and use that cultural model as a unit of analysis. So one way to think of a cultural model, there's many, is in terms of a mindset or an orientation toward a pattern way of interpreting some aspect of the world. By using the mindset as a unit of analysis, we can do a number of interesting things. For one, by analyzing the discourse network of actual people, you can create trackable and observable data of a mindset as essentially a signature that's comprised of actual articles people are reading, the hashtags they follow, content they post, comments, replies, likes, and conversations they're having. In short, the data that describes their way of interpreting the world is contained within this mindset. We think of the mindset as this interpretive lens that's shared among people. We can not only tie it directly to people's beliefs, values, and behaviors, but we can see how we've made an important move away from the need of representing people by labels, classifications, or categories that no longer adequately map to how people conceive of themselves, and indeed are oriented around shared understandings. So this cultural models or mindsets approach offers a new avenue into more inclusive research and a strategy for a few reasons. So when you directly try to represent populations, for example, in something like a persona, you immediately run into the problem of representation itself. Slicing your data or recruiting your sample by some category, for example, ethnicity, really holds dubious value without an a priori theory as to why those categories are relevant, why they comprise the right type of compression. Practically, do we have a theory as to why, say, a Pacific Islander might feel differently than someone from the Middle East? Is it even an issue of ethnicity at all, or is it just a poor proxy for religious, linguistic, geographic, or some other difference that's not contained in that category? But in the interest of efficiency, many categories like these or other demographic categories are accepted as merely generically valuable, as representing something related to diversity, and generally under-theorized. But as a consequence, while on the research design side, these categories are then used to ensure perhaps an appearance of diversity, if they ever make it to the analysis side, they're really imperfect proxies for some other meaningful bit of information. Again, something like language, geography, a belief system, or something else. But in either case, they effectively reify the categories and content of the analyst rather than the person they intend to represent. And you can see where this is especially relevant in the case of gender, which is increasingly interpreted as a fluid, psychologically and individually determined classification. And this presents a challenge methodologically, insofar as the extent to which any research is representational at all, the value lies in the fidelity of the relationship between what's represented and the representation itself. Basically, what do the gender labels actually refer to? So this cultural shift is one example that requires us to re-examine how we maintain research integrity, but also how we accomplish diversity and inclusion without doubling down on the representational problem that we're trying to escape from. So really simply put, how do you hear diverse voices without having to label all of the speakers with very uninformative labels? And so this is where the cultural models and mindsets approach really shines. Focusing on the clusters of meaning themselves, which can be shared across and in between categories of identity, allows you to represent real and empirical phenomenon without having to assume a causal theory built out of a bunch of overlapping, outdated, or fluctuating labels. So this approach has significant impact on the quality of your insights and ultimately the quality of your strategy. So we'll be dealing with actual cultural models and mindsets being held by real people in the world, not merely increasing noisy analytical labels and classifications. And culture is a powerful way to understand the world around you in conditions where everything else is changing, because culture represents the interpretation of that shifting world. It represents what matters and how, and what's more, it really foregrounds how we ourselves participate in making that very culture. We aren't an impartial observer taxonomizing an external world, but are instead a participant in the construction of those worlds themselves. So these mindsets are informed by and include what we ourselves do in the world. And this understanding will directly impact how you understand insights and strategy. So how is that so? Well, we'll take a quick detour about what makes something insightful and then circle back around to what it all means together. So in industry, we all have an intuitive sense of what's insightful and what makes for a good insight, or what makes for what people call an actionable insight. We also know that insight isn't a mere observation. It's not just trivia or not just a simple claim. When I'm talking about insights here, I'll be referring roughly to the work of Canadian philosopher Bernard Lonergan, who I think does a fantastic job of helping us understand what it takes for something to be insightful, and helps explain why the cultural approach is so powerful. For one, culture is really crucial for connecting insights to strategy. It answers the critical and sometimes brutal questions that go beyond mere trivia. Not just what's happening, but why does it matter? So what is insightful? So Lonergan, again, I mentioned, talks about 4 essential interconnecting attributes of an insight. And these should be familiar to anyone calling in here, I'd imagine, but it's worth revisiting. So the basic anatomy of the insight is comprised of these 4 things: experience, understanding, judgment, and decision. An insight is not a linear or one-time event, but it's a recursive and ongoing process. It involves constant feedback and refinement, with each insight leading to further experiences, understandings, judgments, and decisions. And overall, and here's the important part, I think, is this definition of insight goes beyond simple comprehension and incorporates the transformative and active nature of human cognition. It's critical to how we understand our role in creating rather than predicting futures, going back to the Drucker quote. So taking a brief moment at these helps to understand the power behind the cultural approach relative to that. So as we know, insight begins with a direct encounter with reality, whether it's through sensory perception, empirical observation, or a personal encounter. So experience essentially provides the raw material upon which insights are built. An advantage of the cultural approach is that it starts with the phenomena itself. So primary methods like semiotic research and ethnography, for example, build their understanding from the direct experience of the ways in which people behave, interpret, and create the world, rather than starting from abstractions and categories. So semiotics, for example, uses as primary data the artifacts, materials, language, and otherwise tangible material culture created by people, in much the same way that archaeologists analyze the materials and output of actual behavior of people in the past. Ethnography, as we know, starts with the lived experiences of people in context, drawing information from the lived realities of people's lives beyond what is said. And so insight needs to start with these direct observations of the world and the ways people create meaning. This much we know. And we also know that insight requires understanding and judgment, understanding being the process of making sense of the data and information derived from experience, and judgment is the critical evaluation and assessment of the insights gained. So this is fairly obvious stuff and is bread and butter of what the insights industry is all about. But here's where I'd like to offer a bit of a provocation that I think touches upon the 4th aspect of an insight, which is decision. So the provocation is this: the problem with insights function is that it's an insights function, as though it's a separable module of some greater machine. But the extent to which a research function produces insight is exactly the extent to which it operates well beyond its explicit function, beyond the epistemological concerns, getting into those pragmatic and strategic ones. And the phrase actionable insights, we hear this a lot, but really proves this point precisely. It implies that there are insights which are not actionable, which is in fact nonsense. And mature insights professionals know that there aren't insights outside of what an insight is for and what is done with them. A mentor of mine used to say that research is the conscience of a company. It's not enough to just merely supply information. And this gets to the heart of what we mean with the Peter Drucker quote at the beginning: the best way to predict the future is to create it. A commitment to being insightful is a de facto commitment to co-producing rather than reporting on the world. Insights are fundamentally strategic and can't exist outside the logic of decision-making. And the decisions about what knowledge is for, what our company intends to be in the world, what world you create, are every bit as important as experience, understanding, and judgment. And these decisions are themselves cultural, produced in light of your purpose, your identity, your value, and your meaning. So these recursive wheels of cultural co-production and commitment implied by what's insightful brings me finally to how these seemingly disparate points I've been making really tie together. So far, we've talked a bit about industry disruption, AI tools and analytics, We talked about culture and its importance for understanding people, what it means for diversity. And finally, we talked about insights and decisions and what does it all add up to? What can it do? So essentially, cultural research can help you define your space, clarifying and focusing in ambiguous spaces, expanding a claustrophobic space, identifying opportunities and pathways, inspiring innovation, structuring diverse inputs, even providing a North Star. And I talked a little bit about cultural mindsets, which really define your audience. You can help you inhabit the world of your audience to complement your existing segmentation, for screening in support of co-creation and co-design, and for telling you who and what is worth tracking. And all this is possible because we're really at a critical inflection point. Because of all the upheaval, disruption, acceleration of change I mentioned earlier, many of the clients I talk to are rethinking everything, what they build, who their customers even are, what problems they solve, and what role they play in the future, if any. But the incredible news is that now, probably more than any other time, we also have the tools and the perspectives that can allow us to realize rather than represent the futures that we want to live in. The cultural perspective not only provides us with a unit of analysis that's more truthful to our data, it assists us in our goals of inclusivity without reifying the categories that inadequately represent us. Advances in big data and AI have only made it clear how valuable culture is as an object of inquiry. And these capabilities are what make possible the ability to shift our reliance from abstractions and representations toward cultural models and mindsets with much more detailed understanding of behavior at larger and more spontaneous and trackable scale. This examination of culture also forces us to notice that we too comprise, in part, the object of our inquiry. We aren't impartial observers of some external world, but are rather proactive agents within it, with the ability to influence, shape, and form the future of people rather than on behalf of people. And this is how the best of our insights profession already behaves, not as a discrete function that produces insights, but integrated into the strategic decision-making, without which there are no insights at all. So we're really living at a time of massive disruption, but we have the tools to adapt. We can respond to cultural change, but also recognize and take advantage of these feedback loops with our own companies as co-producers of culture and with our own insights professionals as co-producers of strategy. And in this way, I believe that a cultural perspective is not only a path to solving these practical problems mentioned earlier, but really a path to creating more meaningful futures. Thank you.
Michael, thank you very much. That was definitely a thought-provoking, very compelling presentation. So really appreciate that. Again, if you have any questions for Michael, please feel free to add them to the Q&A box. I see we actually have a few that have come in already. So let me kick us off with the first one here. So Michael, what business functions should have this bridge of cultural context front and center? Insight, innovation, CX, other, all of the above?
Yeah, I mean, there's the it depends answer and the all the above answer. I've seen it work really effectively at the kind of really upfront and upstream spaces of strategy, planning, brand, where you're essentially establishing the context space of where you're going to be doing your work. So typically I've seen it work really effectively kind of at where you have some of those big questions like what is the future of X or how do I understand Y? But I've also seen it work in downstream in R&D. For example, like R&D folks will be looking at a bunch of technologies and they want to know what should I be focusing on? Where should I prioritize what I'm doing? And culture can be a tremendous input there. And then obvious creative CX, UX, and creative spaces where you're really trying to understand, well, what are the specific cultural contexts that really matter and kind of inform how someone will experience something.
Okay, excellent. Another one. How are cultural mindsets different from personas?
Yeah, that's a good one. It goes back a little bit to what I was saying about representation. So typically, personas are typically based on like representing a type of person and saying, okay, here's the type of person. They match this kind of criteria that are things that we can ostensibly measure in the world. And you use that as kind of an object to represent a person. But one of the challenges with that is that people aren't necessarily the static kind of representable things in that way. And so that's a challenge. I'm sure you've probably seen that meme, the Ozzy Osbourne and Prince Charles one. If you haven't, look it up. about the challenge of a persona that you could match many of your kind of demographic and socioeconomic criteria and yet have completely different mindsets. So I think the mindset thing is really different in that way. One of the most important parts is that mindsets can be shared. So in some ways, you could think of it like almost how we think of languages. So you can inhabit another mindset. By and large, a mindset is like an interpretation about some aspect of the world that are shared. In anthropology, we call these cultural models. And a cultural kind of group will share these kind of cultural models of how the world works and what their mindsets are. Now, an anthropologist can go into another cultural context and through some learning and through some time and through some education, really start to inhabit and understand that mindset and understand those cultural models. And what's really powerful about that is, in some way, like languages, they are things you could define about the world. They're real phenomena that exist out there, but they aren't so claustrophobic and so static as something like a persona. So I think they work really well to define a real part of the world, but that allow for a little more flexibility.
Yeah. Okay. Very good. And then I think we have time for one more. Just following up on the mindsets question. How have you used cultural mindsets?
Yeah, I think one way to use it, we can do work that like tells you a broad view of kind of a cultural understanding of a space. And that's fantastic information. One of the things that's really cool about the mindsets, though, is that you can use them in conjunction with things like segmentation, like more traditional segmentation, to really enhance it. You can use a mindset to say, look, there are these 5 different mindsets about a space. Let's say adventure and travel, or something like education and technology, or something like that. And you could say, look, these are differentiated mindsets. I can understand people by the mindsets that they kind of typically inhabit. I can use that to say, you know what, if I'm doing co-creating a particular type of experience, I might want to recruit against the mindset and say, look, I need to find people with this mindset because it's well aligned with their brand. It's well aligned with their vision. That's who I want to co-create with. I think that is a really powerful example. I think another one is to help inspire designers, for example, in the same way you might use something like a persona, but if you can understand the mindset, if you can kind of inhabit that, it helps to make stronger inferences about how a design will be received, it'll be understood, how communications, how your marketing will be understood. So I would say those are typically how I've used it, and I work well.
Excellent. We had one more that kind of snuck in here at the end here. Question, what's the best association to join to stay up to date on cultural contexts and insights?
Yeah, that's a great question. I've joined a couple of them. I'm a big, I'm the on the board for the Society for Anthropological Sciences. Society for Applied Anthropology is another great one that really helps you understand kind of cultural models is a frequent topic, and there's been just a ton of academic work there that's really important. EPIC is a great community of practitioners who are putting a lot of this qualitative and social science to work in industry. So I would say Society for Anthropological Sciences is great. Society for Applied Anthropology is great. EPIC is great. Those 3, I think, are just really powerful.
Okay, excellent. Well, I think with that, we've covered all the questions. So I think that concludes part 3 of our summer learning series. I hope everyone's enjoyed it. And thank you, of course, for taking the time to join us. In order to create a better experience for future sessions, we'd love to hear from you. And you can click on the pop-up in your screen now to take a quick 2-minute survey, or click the link in the follow-up email with the recording that will be sent to you shortly. And once again, thank you for coming, and have a great rest of your day. Thanks all.